Going into this movie, I had one question for George Miller.
Do you have it in you to make it epic?
Let's find out what the answer is. So Furiosa, a Mad Max saga, is a prequel to 2015's Mad Max Fury Road. It is directed by George Miller, just like all of the films in this series. I love Fury Road. I think it's one of the greatest action films of the 21st century, next to a couple others, namely Mission Impossible Fallout, but it's tough to top what we got in that movie in terms of practical effects, in terms of the movie really just being one giant 2-hour chase sequence. And as far as the world of Mad Max goes, there's such a deep mythology there, not necessarily in terms of storytelling, but in terms of visuals. George Miller is just a madman. I watched the first 3 films for the first time a couple days ago, and to be honest, the series is a little up and down for me. I wasn't a huge fan of the first one. It was like a revenge film with only the last 20 minutes being the revenge stuff, you know, the stuff that I signed up for, and it wasn't quite as post-apocalyptic and crazy looking as the sequels would go on to be. I loved the second one, thought it was everything that I wanted from a Mad Max film, basically what Fury Road did, but with more practical effects, more of that 80s energy. Beyond Thunderdome is a mixed bag. I think it has some really cool stuff initially with Bartertown, and then it goes way off the rails when Max winds up in this like child cult. But Fury Road is a 5-star film, so going into this, I was very excited. In fact, it's one of my most anticipated films of the year. But I also went in acknowledging the fact that it's probably not going to top what came before. So when it didn't top what came before, I wasn't surprised by it, but Furiosa is still a rockin' time in the theaters, guys. I like Anya Taylor-Joy, but I wasn't sure how she would fill the shoes of Charlize Theron, who is, in my opinion, a superior actress, and they don't look identical. But I gotta say, she really impressed me. Where she lacks in physicality, she makes up for greatly with just the greatest facial expressions. When she's on her quest for revenge, you feel the rage, you feel the desire for bloodlust that she has. And this movie does have a lot of similarities to Fury Road, but it's also very different in some ways. And I'm kind of glad in a certain sense, because I don't think they could have taken what they did in Fury Road and just repeated that all over again. If they just gave us another movie that's 2 hours of a long-ass chase sequence, basically the Fast and Furious franchise's wet dream, I don't think that could have worked a second time. So what we have here instead is an origin story for Furiosa that goes all the way back to her childhood and her relationship with her mother, which tragically gets cut short through a series of events that we watch unfold in the first hour. That's right, the entire first hour of this movie completely lacks Anya Taylor-Joy. And that is an issue that I want to talk about real quick. I think the pacing is a little too slow in the first hour. You know where it's going to a certain extent, and I kind of was getting to the point where I was like, all right, I understand. Can we get to what I want to see, which is the revenge story? I know this is my most common criticism, but I wish filmmakers would get it through their head that more isn't necessarily better. Your movie doesn't need to be 2.5 hours long just for the sake of being 2.5 hours long. Case in point, I think they could have trimmed this down a good 20-30 minutes. With that said, I do like the more methodical pace. I'm glad they decided to world build a bit more here. Obviously, we've seen these locations before. We see the Citadel again, we see Immortan Joe again, but there are also new faces here like our main villain, Dementis, played wonderfully by Chris Hemsworth. I've always thought Chris Hemsworth is honestly an underrated actor, but this is one of the first times that I've seen him truly disappear into a role. Like, you kind of forget that you're watching Chris Hemsworth, and instead you're just watching this completely original character who is both charismatic, terrifying, and hilarious, all kind of blended together wondrously. And that's what George Miller does so well. He crafts this world that feels so distinctly George Miller, from the visuals to the color palette. I regret to inform you that there's nothing quite as insane in this movie as the dude playing the guitar in Fury Road, but it comes damn close with some of these high-octane modded vehicles, massive crashes and explosions, and I've seen a lot of people critique the CGI in this movie, and I will say there are a few moments that are noticeably green screened, and it does take you out of the movie temporarily for a few seconds, but I don't think the CGI is bad per se, and let's not act like Fury Road didn't have some visual effects involved there as well. One thing I didn't mention about the story is that it's divided into 5 chapters, and once again, I think from like 3 onward, this is close to being on par to Fury Road. I just think the first hour or so is a little bit slower than it needed to be, and that's going to be something that influences my rewatches in the future, because I plan on seeing this again, but I feel like I'm going to be tempted to fast forward through some of the origin stuff. There's also a point in this where I feel like it jumps around through locations so much that It felt a little bit like overkill. They maybe could have tightened the plot even post time jump a little bit, but I don't quite get the criticism that this movie isn't necessary, because I do think it adds a lot of insight into Furiosa's character. She's a very tragic character. This movie goes to some dark places. I mean, what happens to her with her mother at the beginning I won't spoil, but I think you can decipher from the trailer that it's not good. And she winds up as a prisoner of Dementis before being transferred over to Immortan Joe. There she pulls off an Arya Stark and presents herself as a boy so that she doesn't have to become one of his wives one day. And you see the resourcefulness that comes from her, but also the desperation when she eventually discovers that fire inside of her, or rediscovers that fire inside of her to take vengeance on Dementis for what he took from her. It's some great stuff, and in the final 15 minutes of this, I was starting to worry, like, ooh, this might turn out to be kind of anticlimactic. How are they gonna end this? And what they did was actually pretty clever, and I found myself pretty satisfied with the ending, and it leads into Fury Road in a nice enough fashion. It's not perfect, and there's always that danger of going into a movie like this with your expectations being sky high and of course not being met. For me, I greatly enjoyed the film. I think it's awesome. So I'm going to give Furiosa a Mad Max Saga 4 stars. As always, I'm very curious to see where this falls with the rest of the fandom. So if you do see Furiosa, let me know in the comments what you thought of it, and how does it compare to the other beloved entries in this franchise like Fury Road and Mad Max 2. If you want to see more content like this, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe while you're at it. I'll catch you in the next one. See you later, guys.